What is up, guys, and welcome to this special episode of Guarani Vision, the first ever podcast dedicated to Paraguayan football in English. As always, I'm Roberto Rojas, and joining me is my great co-host, Ralph Hanna. And Ralph, and everyone here listening on Guarani Vision, we are full in Copa America form. Obviously, we both have the Avi Rojas shirts. Right here on Guarani Vision, we'll be obviously talking about the big competition that Paraguay will be participating in the United States here. We'll be fortunate enough to go to some games here stateside. And of course, we need to analyze everything that's going on with La Europa. But of course, we also need to analyze who we're facing because they'll be facing on Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica. And what better way to kick it off with our kind of group stage previews than with Peter Shea, the owner of Santos FC in English, to really discuss o Seleção, their chances against Paraguay, their overall mood, I guess, for this Copa America title as they look to win their first Copa America since 2019 after missing it out in the final against Argentina, and talk about the kind of this little rivalry that we have with Paraguay. So, Peter, I'm so happy that you're on. I'm really happy to have you on. And before we get started on the whole Brazil chat in terms of the national team, I have to ask, what is your connection with Brazilian football? Because, of course, you are a Santos fan. But what's the connection for those that don't know more about you and, of course, Santos FC in English?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, guys. Really appreciate it. Yeah, it's actually a funny story, and I'll kind of truncate it here. But in brief, I'm not Brazilian, but I became infatuated by Brazilian football probably around 2006. Well, definitely around 2006 in the World Cup. As you can tell by my accent, I'm an American, and I only cared about ice hockey really up until that point. Total fluke coincidence, found the World Cup on TV that summer, and fell in love with the game, the culture surrounding it, and just this worldwide event that meant so much to so many people. And that was just totally uncharted territory towards me, or to me. And really the only team I knew about at that time was Santos, kind of ironically. I had no idea how the leagues worked back then. I was a kid. And I just knew this club that played in white in Brazil that had Pelé on it. And that's really why I kind of labeled myself as a Santos supporter in the beginning. And that kind of led into being interested in Brazilian football. And of course, then the Seleção. So that's kind of an abbreviated version of how it happened. So, but I've been following it on a day-to-day basis really since, I don't know, for maybe the last decade or so. So it's been kind of a journey, and sometimes I feel by extension Brazilian, but I always like to clarify because I don't want any stolen valor here.
No, no, absolutely. We totally understand. I mean, look, we have Ralph here, obviously an Englishman who, I think if I remember correctly, discovered Paraguay during one of the World Cups, I think in '98, if I'm not mistaken. So, we're all here at Guarani Vision. I think in the football community as well. Like we're always open to people who are fans of teams, of countries, of players, really. I think it's a wonderful thing to do, and I think it obviously connects us wholeheartedly on all fronts. And there are people out there that maybe aren't Brazilian and like Brazil because of a certain player or the way that they play or team, anything. Similar over Paraguay as well. I'm sure there are Paraguayan fans out there that aren't Paraguayan, but they like the team because of what they have. So no, I totally get it. And that's a really great story to go in. And it's good that you say the decade because of course in the last decade, I think for Brazil, it's kind of been a roller coaster ride, you would say. I think obviously when we go into Brazil, we obviously see them as this big powerhouse in South America. It's been a while since they've won the World Cup. It was back in 2002. And, obviously their success has been labeled in Copa Americas, which they've won, four, seven, and most recently in 2019 on home soil. But it's been a while since they've been winning it consistently. Now they go into this tournament here in the United States. If you recall, the last time they were here, it was in 2016 when they got eliminated in the group stages, when everyone thought that they were going to be one of the favorites or maybe the favorite to win the title. But here we are, 2024, June 13th, about exactly a week at the time of recording of the start of the Copa, before their first game against Costa Rica. And I just wanted to ask you, firstly, just the overall vibe for you as a fan or just speaking to people who are Brazilian, because obviously here we are speaking a day after they drew the United States in Orlando. And, obviously they've got results against Mexico, a draw against Spain, and a 1-0 win against England at Wembley. So, just your overall thoughts on what you've seen from Brazil so far under Dorival Jr. and just your overall hope for them in this Copa America.
Well, I mean, I'll start with the that that last part of your question. The hope obviously is to win it. When you're Brazil, you're always in tournaments, in matches to win. There's no other acceptable outcome. But as far as, what I'm anticipating and what I think what a lot of people are, anticipating, it's kind of a big question mark, right? Right? You mentioned those four matches. Those are the four matches Dorival has been in charge. Um, and there's still a lot of questions. We have new players, new faces in each call of the national team. You saw some interesting mixtures of players against the US and against Mexico. And I think kind of some subpar results, especially when you look at where the team's been, in the last early part of this decade. Um, you know, I think there's just more questions than there are answers at this point. And it's really going to be interesting to see how Dorival answers those questions as the tournament progresses. I think the biggest one, right, that I think the sexiest one is, of course, who are they attacking three, right? How can you have, so you have Vinicius Jr., of course, easily the best player in the world when it comes to club football. He had an incredible campaign in the Champions League. I mean, an incredible player. Not really doing it for Brazil. So can you drop the best player in the world to make a different front three? How do you work? Do you work the team in around Vinny? Can you put Rodrigo on the right? Rodrigo, you mentioned I'm a Santos fan. Rodrigo originally was on the left. He scored his first goal for Santos on the left wing. Very versatile player. So there's a lot of questions on the top line, the midfield. Some of the new faces, Ederson from Atalanta, had a great club season as well, but looked totally out of place. So really, I think it's just going to be, kind of an anxious start to the tournament. It's going to be, let's get these results and let's try to find the right mix of players before we, face a team that can really do a lot of damage. Like in Argentina, like Uruguay. And even after that result against the US, I'm a little bit more nervous about Colombia as well.
Hey Peter, I'm going to jump in with the question now. Thanks for joining us. So I wanted to expand a bit on this about the question marks around Dorival and just to try and explain to people about this coach who I was looking at his track record. He's only ever coached in Brazil. He's usually only stays 6 months to a year. I think his longest time was actually in Santos. He almost did 2 years. He left just before the 2-year mark. How does a guy like Dorival end up becoming the national team manager? And what was the reaction when he was given the job just a few games ago?
Well, you mentioned it's a kind of a quintessential story of a lot of Brazilian managers. I'm sure there's some similarities in Paraguay as well, but I mean, it's just a rotating carousel of managers in Brazil. They say, lose 3 games at home and you're out, and Dorival's been a victim of that. So I think that kind of explains his bizarrely long journeyman CV. But how did we get him? That is another good question. Well, you kind of have to go back to, again, the association, the CBF, and some of their wishful thinking that really hurt the association and the team, basically convincing themselves that Carlo Ancelotti would come, getting the Ancelotti light, you could say, Fernando Diniz, kind of a caretaker role to kind of feed this team into a formula that Ancelotti could just take over and then take to the World Cup and everyone's off and having a good time. But it didn't happen. They fell right on their faces and it was embarrassing for them. Fernando Diniz crashed out, as you've seen. He's been doing so for Fluminense as well. And so Dorival was kind of the next up. You had Renato Gaúcho, the coach of Grêmio, who'd been national team coach Flamengo as well, but really only had success with Grêmio. And Dorival had really just won a very impressive Copa do Brasil with Sao Paulo, defeating actually his former team Flamengo in the final. And there's a lot of discussion in Brazil about should we have a foreign manager, and just I think some of the thinking around that is that the national team needs to have a Brazilian manager. And really Brazilian managers don't really cross the pond. So I think they went with kind of what they saw as the best current manager in Brazil, which is Dorival Jr. I think it was a sigh of relief when it happened. But I don't think that he's maybe at the level of some of the other national team coaches that you might see with the big sides in Europe. But I think he is good enough to get the job done in the tournament.
Okay, and one of the things you mentioned was sorting out the attacking three, but what we saw with Brazil, and going back to Denise as well, was they're conceding a lot of goals. And this is actually a question that comes from our co-host Fede, who can be with us today. He was asking, what do you think are going to be any of the defensive switches to try and stop consistently conceding goals? Like we saw last night, again, they conceded to the US.
Yeah, I mean, again, he's tried different mixes of players and they keep conceding. I mean, I think with Denise it was a lot worse. And you see that with Fluminense as well. But yeah, I just think that it's tough to say that, you know, the fullbacks have always been an issue for Brazil over the past few years. And I think they play it a little bit safe. And I think a lot of people were excited about Yan Couto coming in and being kind of this flashy attacking outside back on the right side. But you saw it in the Mexico game. He had a great assist, and then it was his man that scored in one of the Mexican goals. So I don't know if he's really the answer, which leaves kind of Danilo or maybe even Militao on the right side. So I wouldn't be surprised if he experiments with that. As far as the center backs go, again, it's just seeing who is the best partnership. I really like Lucas Beraldo. I think he's got so much potential, and I think he's played well. I think he played the 2 games against Spain and England where they got more positive results, I would say, even though the Spain game was a bit of a shit show at times. And then I think he played Bremer in that role against the US and Mexico, a lot worse results. So it's going to have to do some tinkering. We could even see Marquinhos. I think he's more there as a team guy, a locker room guy. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I would love to have an answer. And I think Dorival is looking for that answer right now, but I think you might see some different combinations throughout the group stage.
Okay, nice. And I have a final question, just I suppose more generally about Brazil in the Copa. Brazil is known in World Cups as a team that gets to the final and wins. There's the one result against France, of course, where they don't win a real final, and then there was like a de facto final in 1950, but it was essentially a group stage game. Whereas the reverse is true in the Copa America. They've actually lost. They've been runner-up 12 times, and they've won the tournament 9 times. And there's always been, obviously, the most recently against Argentina, but there's often been a feeling maybe that the Copa America, the mentality maybe isn't the same as when they face a World Cup. Does that come through in Brazil? Do people feel like, I don't know, maybe the Copa is more somewhere to experiment than something to win? Or is it just maybe a mental block they might have when going into the tournament?
Yeah, I think it's the former. I saw a little bit or I guess I read a few articles about exactly that mentality of, the Brazilians maybe not prioritizing this tournament as much as, of course, the World Cup, but the focus, this trophy perhaps isn't worth as much to them as it is to other nations. And I think you could say that that's maybe a reason why they have a kind of a lopsided result when you look at the finals. So I think that definitely contributes. But also, I mean, you've seen some spectacular games. I mean, you mentioned the last game, 2021, was one of the most exciting games, intense, that I've seen, and they were just beaten by a better team. And I think, I can't speak to some of the earlier finals, but in every final that I've seen them play, they tend to bring an intensity that I think is worthy of a final. But yeah, on the whole, I would say that you're right. It's a contributing factor that maybe they didn't value this competition as much.
So obviously a country that do value it is of course Paraguay, as we mentioned here. And obviously they haven't won it since 1979. So of course it's even more important to go into a tournament like this, especially when you look at it from a whole standpoint of them playing against Colombia, Brazil, and Costa Rica. So I wanted to ask you about that because, obviously Paraguay and Brazil obviously are neighbors. They have a lot of political, geographical history, you would say. Obviously, we're not even going to go and speak about the wars as well, but, they have some history. They have some good and bad history. But specifically on the football, I think obviously from what we've seen against Paraguay and Brazil, in recent times, we have seen Brazil get the upper hand against Paraguay. And even for a long time, even before that, Paraguay have kind of been a bogey team, you would say. I think prior to their last World Cup qualifying process, I think since 1985 or something, that Paraguay had not lost to Brazil at home in Asunción. So and this is a team that won World Cups and Copa Americas in the process, had legendary players. And of course, we always saw in the Copa America in two of the last three Copas that they faced each other, Paraguay beat them on penalties. And in the third time, went back to a penalty shootout where Brazil won in the quarterfinals and eventually won the title. So, Peter, I just wanted to ask you personally, how you view Paraguay, at least from a Brazilian perspective, because I think there are some people out there that perhaps maybe don't know much about this history, but do you feel as if though, even if they haven't been performing to the best extent that we or Ralph, I guess, Ralph and I have been able to follow this team, but do you feel like that Brazilians will still feel this sort of, I wouldn't say fear, but at least give them the respect that they need when they do take the pitch in Las Vegas in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, and that's something that I've kind of been nervous with. I would say in general, uh, Brazilian football has maybe a bit of a humility problem and an arrogance problem. And I am a little bit concerned about a nation like Paraguay and Colombia. I was concerned about Colombia, and now even more so. But I think there's a lot of glossing over these two teams in the group, because I think Brazilians are just taking it for granted that they're gonna fly through the group in first place, and they're not gonna have to worry about either Paraguay or Colombia. For me personally, I mean, I think that Paraguay can be a tough side to play against. Roberto, I follow you on social, and Ralph as well, and I see a lot of the highlights that the Paraguayan players are doing in competitive leagues. So I think that it could definitely be a bogey team. And again, you referenced the history. Sometimes I feel like when people are pulling these stats out from 1950, 1960, it's meaningless. But I do think more recent history definitely if it's not on the front of your brain, it's definitely in the back. So I think I'm a little bit more concerned than the average, Brazilian fan, or certainly Brazilian Twitter commentator. But yeah, I think most Brazilians, when they're thinking about the Paraguayans, I think they are thinking it'll be a win, and I think they're mostly thinking about, okay, how is Gustavo Gomez doing? How is whoever player, the kid from Sao Paulo, Bobadilla, is he going to play? I think that's how they're thinking about it. So that kind of concerns me a little bit. because I think both of those teams should be taken seriously. Yeah, I'm eager to see what happens because I think Paraguay could be a tough side to beat.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that because obviously we've seen a lot of Paraguayans, not just now, but even historically, have performed well in Brazil. You mentioned Gustavo Gomez, probably one of the greatest Palmeiras players, not just as a defender, but probably ever, because obviously he was champion of the Copa Libertadores for multiple times. He's the captain. He's kind of earned that sort of respect from the Palmeiras fans and even the Brazilian football fans. But there's always that big kind of hurdle of him doing the same for the Paraguay national team. So he's been subject to critics as well. Here is and looking at other players like Matias Villasanti who are at Gremio, Angel Romero, played at Corinthians and playing and had his time there. Denis Gonzalez, a player that really didn't have a good spell
Yeah.
at Santos, but of course he's probably going to be part of the national team. But you mentioned Damian Bobadilla, Junior Alonso, who used to play at Atletico Mineiro. So we've had a lot of players who have, of course, played in Brazil or have had experience taking on Brazilian teams, be it in the Copa Libertadores or the Sudamericana or even on the national team. I just want your thoughts on how you view those players. And do you feel that even now, with what you've seen with Brazil recently, even if they got the wins that they got, and of course the draws that they got, do you feel as if though just looking at how these players that, and I think Raul can also agree with as well that because of how they feel as if though they're the underdog and they're facing a big team like Brazil, that you feel like they're actually going to switch it up, and I think Brazilian fans can feel a bit worried of what they can do and snatch a result there when they do face in Vegas.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I have to reiterate my worry about that. Because I mean, yeah, you mentioned some of the other players. I mean, uh Vija Sante is an incredible player for Gremio. And Gustavo Gomez, I mean, just to comment on him, he is such a great player for Palmeiras. But I mean, he's a great player, great defender. But what kills me is the fact that, I mean, this guy has like tons of goals. He's a goal scoring machine. He's one of the most like offensive uh in terms of production, goal scoring center backs that I've really seen. And it just seems like week in and week out. I think, he was approaching 10 league goals. I don't know if it was last year or the year before. Something ridiculous like that. And he's such a talisman for them. He's such a rally point for Palmeiras. And when you have a leader in like that, you can't underestimate, what they can do and how they can get the rest of the team to rally around them. And yeah, it makes Paraguay an extremely, tough opponent that I really don't think people should write off. And also on Derlis Gonzalez, he didn't maybe have the most explosive time at Santos, but I think there was a rumor going around that he may return last year, or the year before, and Santos fans really, really liked that rumor. They have fond memories of him. So yeah, don't discount Derlis. I'm kind of a fanboy.
There's always been this kind of discussion that even though Derlis has been playing at Olympia so far, he's kind of turned it up when he needed to for the national team because of kind of important games that he's had. So no, I totally agree. I mean, I wanted to obviously jump into Ralph as well because I think when we look at Brazil, I think obviously we give them respect, but we also have to look at the history too. That maybe Paraguay can just step it up when need be in these games.
Yeah, I think traditionally what Paraguay have always been good at in the national team is players that maybe aren't as good week in, week out, are able to kind of up their level for the national team. Funnily enough, what we're seeing at the moment is the reverse with people like Gustavo Gomez, who you're just talking about how good he's been at Palmeiras. I can't remember his last goal for Paraguay, and I can't remember the last time Paraguay scored, a typical or a classic set piece goal, which is quite strange, and some of the transition we're going through. But I do think thinking about the rivalry, this is one of the big games that Paraguay takes more seriously than maybe Brazil do because they feel like they're the big brother in this kind of rivalry. So I'm looking forward to the game. It's going to come hot on the heels of the Colombia match for Paraguay, where they could be in trouble. Like my cat's playing in the background here, where we could be in trouble with with that Colombia team, which are going to be very difficult. So I think you might see Paraguay really like almost like a wounded animal, kind of having to step up and do something against Brazil. So I think we'll have a very good match there. And Paraguay, of course, have no problem with the heat. So they're going to be in Texas and Vegas, and they'll be quite happy, I think, with those temperatures.
Well, they'll be in indoor stadiums for two of those games, though, Ralph. That's the thing. So maybe it's not going to fare out as well as they should. But hey, you never know in football. I think that's the beauty of it. And even in these tournaments, there's always some surprises. We're going to see that even in the Euros that starts tomorrow, the time we're recording. I'm sure there's going to be some sort of surprises there. But overall, Peter, just to close it out, really with two more questions before we let you go. One, how do you assess this Brazil game? Of course, they still have to play Costa Rica first. That's the first game, so we don't even know what's going to happen there. But overall, what do you feel as though will happen in this game against Paraguay if you want to give a prediction? And also, just your prediction on how Brazil will fare in this tournament overall, if you feel as if though they can indeed win it, or they're going to fall short yet again.
Yeah, I mean, they can win it. But I think it'll be kind of one of those tournaments where, I mean, and I guess most champions, this is the case for them, but I think they'll kind of have to dial it up and increase, their cohesion and throughout the tournament. If they want to, I don't think they're probably the best team in terms of cohesion or even just on paper right now in this tournament. But so I think they can win it. Will they win it? I'm not as sure. I'm a little bit down on them, but we'll have to see. As far as Paraguay goes, I think they will win, and I think it's going to be a hard fought game. It wouldn't surprise me if it's 2-0 Brazil or 2-1 Brazil. And I'm kind of kicking myself because I haven't even brought him up until now, but I think we've been on here 30 minutes maybe, but we haven't even brought up Endrick, I don't think, before. And it wouldn't surprise me. I think Brazil maybe will have a hard time, getting into the groove of things. But if Endrick doesn't start, him coming off the bench later in the game, I think he's good for a goal. So, if it's a 1-1 situation, I think Endrick off the bench could be the difference maker. So that's what I would go. I'll go for 2-1.
2-1. Okay. I like the false, not the false, the cautious optimism, you would say.
Yeah.
Brazil in this game and of course in the tournament as well. So, Peter, I really want to thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it. For those that, of course, if you wanted to plug in any other social media things or whatever, where people can find you on social media, on Twitter, wherever, feel free to fire away.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much, guys. It's honestly so fun. And Roberto, I'm not sure if you share this, but in the US and North America, sometimes, I have all these thoughts in my head about football or soccer, and not as many people to talk about them with. So really happy to talk about football in any venue with people that are willing to listen. So thank you. And secondly, yeah, you can follow me on Twitter if you have any interest in Santos. I'm at Santos FC _Inglés. You can also follow me. So I do a small Brazilian football podcast called The Smoking Snake with my buddy Henrik. And we just do a weekly podcast, bring interviews and talk about what's going on in the rest of the realm. So follow that. It's on Twitter at The Smoking SNK. And yeah. Once again, guys, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
You heard the man. Go follow him right now as you are listening to this, after you're done listening to this episode. So thank you again, Peter, for doing this, for covering Brazil. And thank you to my co-host, Ralph, for being part of this great episode, another preview episode of Guarani Vision, previewing the Brazilian national team for their game against Paraguay at the Copa America. For myself, Roberto Rojas, and Ralph Hanna, thank you so much for listening in. See you soon.